We're going to get started. Welcome to the maintainer session for Cloud Provider Azure. Today is the introduction session. Tomorrow there's a session on the deep dive, and you'll hear me talk about that a couple more times today. Real quickly, we want to introduce ourselves. I'm Craig Peters. I'm a PM in Azure working on open source container stuff. The Azure Cloud Provider is a big part of what we do as a team.
My name is Rita. I'm a software engineering lead at Microsoft.
She doesn't like the title. We'll fix that. So real quickly, what we're going to go through is kind of introductions to the team. Happily, a lot of the team is actually here, so you can actually meet face-to-face with like the people who do this stuff and make it real. We're going to talk about what's happened recently. We're going to look quickly at what we're planning to do next, what our focus is. Then we're going to help introduce you to different ways you can get involved and contribute as much as you want to contribute or understand what's going on and have visibility into that. And then hopefully we'll have some time at the end for some questions. The first thing, though, is that I want to get a sense of who's here. It's really actually pretty interesting to me. I love these conferences because it's a great chance to see people I haven't seen in a long time, to make new friends, to understand what kinds of problems people are facing and how we can solve them together. The thing I observe is that there are more people in this room than probably all of the Azure maintainer sessions combined through Kubernetes history. And so to me, that's a really exciting sign that what we're getting is a combination of people who are using it and people who care, or people who are running into problems and need to solve those. So what I'd like to do real quickly is ask a few questions and see if folks can raise their hands. So how many people here are running Kubernetes on Azure today? Okay, that looks like 75, 80%. Yeah, you guys don't count. Okay, how many are using AKS, the Azure Managed Service? That's about 50%. How
many people are running AKS engine clusters?
So self-managed using our open source tooling. Okay, so that's like 10% or a little less. Okay, how many are here because they want to understand more about how it's changing over time? Okay, that's fantastic. How many are here because they're banging their head against a wall and want somebody to yell at?
Again, you guys don't
I knew
count.
You'd raise your hand, Patrick. I'm glad it's a small number, but also we can do that here too. So.
Also, we keep pointing to people here. I just want to make sure why do we do that? So a lot of people here are actually contributors of Cloud Provider Azure, and I just want to give them a shout out. So please stand up if you have contributed to Cloud Provider Azure.
Please.
Please stand up.
Come on. Yes. Thank you, guys. Absolutely, and that's kind of a segue into the mission, right? So what is Cloud Provider Azure all about? The mission of Cloud Provider Azure is to make Azure the best place that you can operate Kubernetes. Let's just say right up front, we know that we have some work to do, right? There's a lot of things to accomplish. We kind of highlight that this team sitting up here and some over there are contributors to Cloud Provider Azure. They're core Microsoft team members, and we want you to kind of know who they are. If you go and look at the approvers and reviewers in the owners file, you'll see those GitHub handles. I put the names against the folks. Quite a few of them are in the room. Feel free to reach out and talk to us. So one question people might ask is what happened to SIG Azure? There used to be a whole separate SIG for each cloud provider. So just a little bit of history if you don't know already, sorry if this is a repeat, but the cloud providers are now all sub-projects under the SIG cloud provider special interest group. Each one of these, we actually have 3 projects under that. We have the cloud provider Azure, we have the Azure CSI files and Azure CSI disks subprojects to handle all the different nuances of how you deal with storage as well. We're easy to get a hold of, so please reach out to us. Our Slack channel is listed here, Cloud Provider Azure. The mailing lists are certainly available. They're honestly not very active right now. I would love to see more activity there. If you have questions, if you have comments, there are things you're wondering about, reach out on Slack and the mailing list. The biggest thing that's happening right now in all of the cloud providers for Kubernetes is that all of this stuff grew organically over time, right? So as Kubernetes started, the cloud providers were integrated tightly into the core Kubernetes repo, and that's just become unmanageable because so many different projects got there, and a huge portion of the code that is in Kubernetes is actually specific to individual cloud providers and the cloud provider, the Kubernetes Cloud Manager. And so the biggest project is moving all of that out of tree so that we can have a smaller code base in Kubernetes, for one thing, that we can manage the code base for the Azure cloud provider independently of the others, and we can have separate releases. And so all of these things are going to bring a lot of advantages to people who are operating Kubernetes on Azure. As a big part of that, as I mentioned, I was going to plug the deep dive, which is happening tomorrow. Pengfei is going to do a demo of where we are exactly with that extraction of the cloud provider from the main code base. And that happens tomorrow at 11:50, just before noon. So with that, I'd like to transition into what has happened recently.
So 1.16, there were a lot of bug fixes and new features. These were only the ones that fit on this slide. I'm not going to go through all of them, but a lot of big ones that really worth us to talk about. One is API throttling improvements. I don't know how many of you guys actually got hit by the API throttling issue. And so the next slide, we're going to talk about that in more detail. Like, what are some of the things that we put in place to mitigate a lot of those issues? And also, the team updated the Azure SDK from 21.4 to 32.5, which is a huge, huge deal. And then a lot of improvements on load balancer, and then also a lot of bug fixes for disattach and detach. And then also get location of subscription ID from IMDS so that kubelet can actually now run without Azure Identity, and then fix public IP not found issue for VMSS nodes, and then also client request issues for the 429-ish code that comes back, and then the SDKs basically allow the exponential backoff because there was an issue with the SDK. And last but not least, the Azure Stack folks actually added ADFS auth support for Azure Stack, which is great. And also, so 1.17, right? Another really awesome feature that we've added is bring your own key feature capability to manage disk to allow you to bring your own key for disk encryption for VMSS. And also upgrading the SDK to 35. And then again, update, one of the improvement was to update disk lock per VM so that we can actually do concurrent updates for attach and detach, which is a pretty big deal. And as you can see, here's some test results that came out of that fix. Scaling from 10 disk to 60 disk used to take 49 minutes, now it takes 6 minutes. Holy crap.
Hopefully that's good news.
Yeah. And so we thought the API throttling issue deserved its own slide. Specifically, a lot of PRs went into this, specifically switching to list for VMSS instead of get for each instance, and changing the cache TTL from 1 minute to 10 minute for VMSS, and then 1 minute to 15 minute for VMAS. And one major change was to read from stale cache for certain list and get operations. And as you can see, here's just a graphical presentation around how this fix actually improved the number of calls for disk attach and create. And as you can see, back in 1.15.4, it used to take 9,000 requests for, was it 50 disk create and attach, right? And then when the cluster is idle, it somehow made more requests. Terrible. We recognize that. Yeah. Let's go to 1.15.5. Now it takes 5,600 requests for disk create and attach. When it's idle, it's only 48 requests. Now iterate some more, 15.6. Now we get way better number of calls when you create disk and attach. Now you get 3452 number of requests. And then when the cluster is idle, it's only 6 requests. Holy crap. Yeah. So kudos, guys.
Yeah, good job.
And one thing that we really want to touch on is how we do tests for the cloud provider. We recognize there are a lot of things that we could do to improve, but here's how we do things currently. So for a lot of the end-to-end tests that actually run the test grid jobs, currently we use AKS engine to provision a cluster on Azure and run all the E2Es across those clusters. And if you're curious how our team actually maintains a lot of these test jobs, is we make sure that the person who's on call that week actually looks at these jobs, and when the jobs are failing, someone is going to go and look at why they're failing and go actively fix it. So specifically, we have E2E periodic jobs that run on periodically and for PRs for cloud provider Azure. So that's the outer tree one. And then for E2E, and then we also run E2E on PRs for Kubernetes in-tree provider. And then we also have periodic jobs and for PRs for Kubernetes with Windows nodes. And then we also have jobs for dual stack, which is pretty awesome. And I think you're going to hear all about it tomorrow at the keynote. And last but not least, we also have PR and periodic jobs that actually test the Azure Disk CSI drivers as well as the in-tree drivers. Yay.
So all of that's great. We're making progress. We're doing a bunch of stuff to improve all of our lives, to basically make all the code base much more efficient and much more effective with the underlying infrastructure. The key thing is that we're moving towards this ability to have a different cadence and a faster cadence about the cloud provider. Right now we have to wait for a patch release of Kubernetes to make improvements in the cloud provider. We want to be able to hotfix and patch and make sure that we're getting the right stuff to you guys at the right pace that's needed. And getting out of tree is going to enable us to do that. The next thing is that right now there's kind of a bit of a blind spot for a lot of us around how the cloud provider is actually behaving. So we're in the process of beginning to instrument the cloud provider. We're doing some POCs in different parts of things to understand what the impact of that is. But the idea is to make it completely observable so that you can understand exactly how the cloud provider is working, and just as importantly, our team can understand how the cloud provider is working, and so we can make much more improvement on a faster basis by having that kind of observability into it. The next is that we are undergoing kind of a renaissance with the rest of the teams within Azure. So the growth of Kubernetes has been just incredibly fast on Azure. I think the presence of all these people in this room is a testament to that. And one of the things we've observed is that not all of the Azure services have the same kind of prioritization of the kinds of use cases that Kubernetes has. Kubernetes, as an API, it's this closed loop control system that's constantly trying to make things the way you want them to be. And I can say that some of the services that were originally designed more for static kind of VM kind of use cases. And so Kubernetes uses these APIs in ways they weren't originally intended to be used. And I think we're all kind of feeling that. And what we've got now is inside Microsoft is this kind of understanding that we need to collaborate together to make sure that we're delivering the API quality of service that will meet the needs and demands of Kubernetes, and at the same time, we need to improve the cloud provider itself so that it doesn't make unrealistic demands on the underlying infrastructure. So we're coming together, and we're doing that by essentially working first with the VMSS team. This is new capabilities on Azure, and we're introducing our end-to-end tests into their engineering processes. And so, in the past, they've done a release, we've discovered something's wrong, then they've gone and fixed it. Now what we want to do is we want to discover something's wrong before the VMSS does a release. I think that would be revolutionary for a lot of us, and that's coming next. At the same time, what we're doing is we're working with them as they're doing design for new features so that we can understand what those features are and how they should be exposed in the Kubernetes context, what value, if any, they provide, and then how do we represent those? So that's a new kind of, I think, maturation, essentially, of the way in which Kubernetes is consumed inside Azure. The next thing I want to talk about is that Cluster API is emerging as a way in which to manage Kubernetes clusters on lots of different kinds of infrastructure. We have increasingly invested in Cluster API and the provider for Azure. And one of the things that is just immediately true is that you both need to interface with VMSS, both need load balancers, both need to deal with the underlying infrastructure. So we're going to consolidate a lot of that common code into a set of modules so that we have one place to make these improvements and make these fixes, and it's then reflected in this out-of-tree cloud provider, the cluster API provider, and everybody gets the benefit. So this is just sort of an optimization that we're going to do. We've been continually investing in improved end-to-end testing. We have some pretty rich testing already, but we're now going to do a lot more focus on performance and scalability. And most importantly, representing real workload scenarios. So if you look at a lot of the end-to-end tests, they tend to be primarily focused around kind of CRUD operations, so the basics, meat and potato kind of things that you need to do. There's a lot of kind of edge cases that aren't uncovered in that. So we're going to add increasing sophistication to the level of applications that we're putting into our tests. And then finally, the cloud provider for Azure has been very focused on the provider for the public cloud API. Azure is diversifying in the kinds of offerings that we provide in the places where you can consume the managed resources from Azure, including Azure Stack. And so we're working very closely with the Azure Stack team and making sure that as they contribute those capabilities into it, it's integrated tightly into the same common set of core code and testing framework. So that's kind of the high-level picture of what things we have on the plate and the direction we're headed. One of the things I'd love to get out of this is a conversation to understand if these are the right things. Are these the things that will meet your needs in the audience? I'd like to turn this into more of a discussion. We'll come back to that in a second. I just want to make sure that everybody knows how to participate in this community. The cloud provider communities are kind of, in a way, they're kind of different than the other Kubernetes communities in that they are specific to a particular provider. One of the things that we strive to do is to be as transparent and consistent with the rest of the open source community as possible. We conduct our meetings in the open. We post everything on YouTube. The Slack channel is completely open. We keep all our issues in the upstream project board. It's a standard project. The one thing that we've seen is that we haven't had a lot of active participation in the meetings. Recently, we changed our schedule with the hopes of driving up some participation there. They used to be bi-weekly at the same time all the time, and it wasn't a time that was terribly friendly to some of our colleagues in the Asia Pacific area. So what we did is we instituted this alternating schedule where it's on alternating Mondays, either early in the morning for those of us on the west coast of the US, or later in the day. And so I'd love to get some feedback also on whether or not this is working out for folks. So I think we'll come back to that. So let's have a little discussion about the plans. The last thing is Q&A, right? But I think I'd love to get some feedback on what of these things are important to people here, or if there are things that are missing from here that are important to people in the room. So is there a microphone? Do we have a mic by chance? Or I'll just use mine. Oh, you have one? Okay. You got it? Okay. So does anybody have thoughts? Like, are they frustrated they don't see something here, or is there something they want to drill into a little more detail? Silence. A hand. Rita, sorry.
Good. Good exercise.
Yes. No, I think it's, all right, I'm happy to move around.
I'll ask about the Azure stack because we have government cloud and then on-premise the Azure stack. How do you plan on, in those plans, managing that if you have a team that may, say, work on both, knowing that the stack's going to lag behind? What are your thoughts on?
Sorry, I didn't
the services that would go into the cloud provided first and then the stack later.
So I'm going to defer, if it's okay, Javier?
We have two people from Azure Stack here who can actually answer that.
Yeah. Do you mind?
Could you please repeat the question? I was not ready.
The level of service and what will be available on in the cloud and then on the stack, what that plan looks like as far as lag time.
Regarding the services, I don't know. Not every service that runs on Azure can run on Azure Stack because, of course, there is not unlimited disk and memory. But I can look up in the website what's the roadmap for those services. Regarding Kubernetes specific stuff, the hope is that we can have the same, ideally the same cloud provider code base running on both clouds. Right now there is a slight problem that we keep maintain a fork, and that's making things a little harder for people. But if you use AKS Engine, you can have the same experience on both Azure and Azure Stack. And yeah, and that's all I can say.
I just want to add one thing. If you are deploying any application.
Here, hold on.
Here.
So if you are deploying any specific application and using specific features which may not be present in Azure Stack, just like the simplest example is Azure Files. So that may not work, but say you are using only normal Azure Disk and all, will exactly similar work. So if you're deploying that application on Azure and you try to deploy on Azure Stack, it should work. Okay.
Other questions? Or feedback or thoughts or requests? All right.
Everybody's happy. No, I saw one hand about complaining. I think you, or was that in jest?
Here, what are the other enhancements for Cluster API?
For the Cluster API. Well, Cluster API has its own roadmap and its own sessions. I'd rather, if
Are you
it's
asking
possible.
specifically about the Azure provider for Cluster API?
Should we go into Cluster? Are there other people who are interested? Because Cluster API has its own forums, and I guess CapZ.
But it doesn't hurt it.
That's true. Sure.
Yeah, I can speak a bit to that. So we've been investing a little bit in the Cluster API Azure provider recently. I don't know if you've noticed activity on Slack and on the repo, but if you haven't checked that out, I highly encourage you to go hang out with us on the Slack channel, Cluster API-Azure. As far as the roadmap, right now, we're finishing up V1 Alpha 2 and starting to think about V1 Alpha 3. So we're sharing that roadmap with the overall SIG cluster lifecycle project, so that's probably the best place to check that out. I think there are sessions, there's a deep dive happening tomorrow. But on the menu, I guess we have control plane management, VMSS support, end-to-end testing framework, cluster cuddle V2, so improve UX in general, just to name a few. But yeah, we'd love some feedback on that, and if you want to help us and contribute, that'd be awesome.
And a lot of the same people who's been involved on cloud provider and AKS engine also are involved in cluster API Azure.
Did you have a complaint when you raised your hand? Did you want to voice something?
I'll take it offline.
Offline?
It's not
Okay.
appropriate for this.
All right. I guess we appreciate that. Is there a question back there?
Can you raise your hand again? Is there a question? Did you see a hand? Nope.
Oh. Okay. Well, thank you guys very much. I mean, if there are any additional things you want to talk about, we'll be here. And then after this, I'm at the Microsoft booth for the rest of the day. So.
And I also want to mention if you're using, like, say, Pod Identity project or Virtual Kubelet project or Keywell Flex Volume project or Secret Store CSI project, a lot of the maintainers are here, so we're happy to take on any questions about roadmap or feature or feedback. So, did I forget any project?
Yeah, there are like
There's a lot. So.
4 others. Yeah.
Sorry.
It's all good.
All right.
Thank you guys very much. Much appreciated.